Welcome to the EPDM Summer School webinar presented by Hawkridge Systems. This is the third webinar in our Summer School series. My name is Jordan Lemley and I am a PDM specialist with Hawkridge Systems. And today's webinar is tips and tricks for using Enterprise PDM more effectively. It's part of our new initiative at Hawkridge Systems called EPDM Academy, where we focus on helping users learn more about EPDM and begin using it more effectively. So hopefully today's webinar is going to be helpful for those of you that have been using EPDM for a long time, and those of you who are new to EPDM. Hopefully you all get something out of it. So what are we going to be covering today? Here's our outline. We're going to be focused on four main categories. We're going to talk about references, whether that's a reference dialog or adding references to files, using the search tool and how to use that a little bit more effectively, how to be more efficient in the way that you're using licenses, and then any other types of miscellaneous items and tips that don't really fall into any of the other categories. So that's where we're going to be headed today with our content. Got a lot to cover, and hopefully you'll find something interesting and new in this tips and tricks webinar. So the first place that we're going to start is with references. So there's a few different ways that we can add references in Enterprise PDM. And one of those is called paste as reference. We're going to take a look here at Vault and do a little demonstration of that, and then talk about a Hawkware tool that makes that process a little faster. And then we'll talk about updating references as you're copying files into the Vault. How do you make sure that your assemblies are referencing the correct parts and drawings and those sorts of things, as well as customizing your reference dialog options. Maybe you don't want to always select everything, all of the subcomponents and parts and sub-assemblies of a file when you're checking it out or pushing it through a workflow. We'll talk about how you can customize that, as well as using the copy tree function to copy files from one directory to another and sharing common data between the two. So a lot to cover here with references. We'll get started with paste as reference. So I'm going to go into a Vault that I have set up here, and I'm going to start by performing a paste as reference. So I've got this specifications document, and I want to add this document as a reference to my support frame. So I've got this SOLIDWORKS assembly, and I want to add some documentation to it. I want that documentation, that specification document, to be referenced by the assembly. And so what SOLIDWORKS Enterprise PDM allows me to do is use a paste as reference function to do that. So the way that this works is I'll go ahead and check out the assembly to make that the parent document. So I'll check it out to myself. And then what I need to do to add this document, this Word document, as a reference, this applies for all kinds of documents. It doesn't have to be a Word document. It could be any other kind of file that you have inside the Vault. But what I'm going to do is just right click and go to copy and go back to my assembly, right click on it, and there's an option in my right click menu called paste as reference, and this is where we add this Word document as a reference or a child of this top level assembly. So I'm going to go ahead and click paste as reference, and you'll see that it'll give me some options to add reference, whether I'm going to show that in the bill of materials or not. And then if I want to specify a quantity for this, if it's some other kind of document that needs a quantity assigned to it. So I'll go ahead and click OK, and I'll go ahead and check in my assembly, and I'll say that I updated the documentation here, and I'll check it in. And what we'll see is that that Word document gets added as part of my contains tab, so it shows me that this is a reference to the assembly. And if I were to check the Word document, check its where used tab, I'm going to see that it's used in that support frame assembly. So that link is created there between the two different assemblies. And if I ever needed to remove this as a reference, all I would need to do is just simply check out the document and remove it via this contains tab. There's a little pencil icon that I can select and remove this item from my references. So I'll go ahead and check that in, say removed documentation, check in, and it's going to remove that from my assembly. So that's how the paste as reference works. Now, if I wanted to add a reference without having to go in through the checkout process, copy paste, and check back in, we've actually created a Hawkware tool for such a purpose to kind of save you a few clicks. We have a development team on staff with Hawkridge Systems that develops these kinds of apps to either help you with automating some tedious tasks or customizing Enterprise PDM to do more specific tasks to your environment. So you can download these tools at hawkwareapps.com. And if I go there, you're going to be able to see the one I'm about to use. It's called Add References. So if you find the Add References app, that's the one I'm about to use in this vault. But just go to hawkwareapps.com. There's a lot of cool stuff on there, a lot of free stuff. This Add References tool is free, so go ahead and check that out. So I'm going to use my Hawkware app to add a document as a reference to this part. So I'm going to right click and go to Add Custom References. And here I can select my file. I'm going to select the Word document. If I click apply, it goes through that whole process of checking the file in and out and adding the reference. So now that specifications document has been added as a reference for my part. So that's a nice little tool that we have there for Hawkware. And next, what I want to cover is the Update References tool. So let's say that I'm copying an assembly from another location inside my vault, or outside of my vault rather, and I want to copy it inside of my vault. So in this case, I might have an assembly with some parts. I'm going to copy that into my training vault here. Now normally, if I'm copying all of the assemblies, parts, and drawings all together, I can simply go in and check in the top level assembly, and it's going to find all those other files because they're in the same directory. But what if those aren't in the same directory, or for some reason the files can't seem to find the other references? How do we handle that in EPDM, making sure that all the references come in okay? So I'm going to take a look at that real quick here in this webinar to help you understand some of the tools that you can use to clean up your references. So go ahead and delete those out, and I'm going to copy in so in this support frame, let's say that I had my assemblies in one folder and my parts in another. And I go ahead and copy both of those into my vault. So there's my two folders. Now let's say that I did something that most of you would know not to do, but let's say it happens. I rename one of those folders. So now things are really probably going to get messed up. So how do I accommodate that in Enterprise PDM? So if I try to check in this top level assembly, it's going to tell me that it can't find those references even though they're inside the vault. So how do I make sure that EPDM knows where to grab those? There's a couple ways that we can do that. So the first way is to use this tools and update references. So this update references tool allows me to find those missing references. So if I click update references, it'll show me the assembly and all the files that it's looking for that it can't really find. So what I'm going to do is select all of those files that it can't find. I'm going to say find files, and it's going to ask me where do I want to search for those files, what folders. I know they're in the parts folder, so I could search through there, but if I wanted to, I could say search in subfolders, and I could look through a lot of different locations inside my vault, but in this case I know they're in the parts folder, so I'm going to go ahead and click next. And it's going to look and see if it can find those files, and it can, so I'll click finish, and it'll replace those missing files with the files that it knows are there, and I can click update, and I'll make sure that those references are updated so that now when I check this file in, it knows to grab all of those files together. And I can say initial check-in and check those files in all at once. So that's nice. So what if I have a parts library or significant repository of parts that I know that my new assemblies or outside assemblies need to look for shared parts in? I don't want to have to go through this manual process, and I know where those directories are. Well, in that case, we have another tool that we have at our disposal that we can use for that purpose. So I'm going to go ahead and delete these folders out and demonstrate that reference tool that we have. That reference tool is under the administration. So every user can have access to this particular tool. This is a user-specific setting. It's not a global setting. But what I can go into my administration tool for is to go into settings, and then under settings there's an option in there called external references, and this allows me to specify a particular location for EPDM to always look in when I'm checking in a file. So if I know that my assemblies always need to look for shared parts in a shared parts folder, I can just specify that folder for EPDM to look in automatically. This might slow down your check-in process as it's going through many different folders, and another thing to be aware of is that it's only one folder deep, so it's not going to go and search in different subfolders because that would just add to the searching time for the check-in. So if I wanted any subfolders, I would need to add those folders explicitly here. But what I'm going to do is add a folder location here. Probably what I'll do first though is copy in the assemblies and parts folders and then specify that parts folder for my assemblies to look in. So I'm going to go in here to my new folder, paste, and I'll change the name here to break some links. And if I go into settings again, external references, select the vault that I'm interested in, add, and then specify the location. I need to be in training vault there. There we go. Training vault, legacy, new folder, and then the parts 1 folder. That's where I want my assemblies to look. So I'll click OK. And so now when I go into assemblies, I'm going to try and check this in, and it will know to look in that folder for those assemblies. So I can go ahead and check those in from there. So that's how we can use the update references tools. Like I said, there's a couple. There's the little more manual process using tools and update references. And then you've got your second option, which is to specify a particular folder location for each local user under the settings in their admin tool. We'll go ahead and talk about our reference dialog options as well related to references. So if you're trying to check out or check in a document and you want to customize the way that you're prompted with that information, maybe you want to always check out just the assembly, or you always want to check out the assembly and its component parts. You want those to be the default. You can customize that option in EPDM. So for example, if I wanted to check out this document, I'm going to check out my assembly. You see here that my default is to only check out the top level assembly and not check out its children components. What I can do is customize that setting so that I will always by default grab the children when I do a checkout. And the way that you can do that, each user can do this on their own, is you can come up here to the toolbar next to Actions, Modify, Display, and Tools. Right click, go to Customize Menus. And then there's an option in there under Reference Dialog. And one of those options is try to check out all reference files when the referencing file is checked out. Basically, select all the children by default. So once I select that, click OK. When I go to check this document out, you're going to see that it's going to automatically select the children. So that's how I can control that option, whether that is selected by default or not. And like I said, that's a user-specific setting, but you could apply that to a lot of different users all at the same time, just via the groups in the administration tool. So for example, I can go into training Vault, take a look at a groups node, and I look at engineering, and under settings, this is the settings that we were looking at earlier. I can go to settings and reference dialog and apply that option to all of my users all at the same time. So you can apply that at the group level, but each user can change that to their liking as well. Another option that we have is the change state dialog. So if I right click on a file and go to change state, no approval required, you see that it's only going to move the assembly. But what if I want all the children to automatically be checked in this dialog? Well, I can change that setting as well. And it's in the same location as before. So if I click customize menus, I can go to reference dialog, and there's an option in there called do not mark reference files when changing state. So if I deselect that, it's going to allow me to have those references automatically selected. So when I go to no approval required this time, it automatically selects each one of those checkboxes for the children. So that's how I can control those references via the reference dialog option in your settings. All right, so we talked about the paste as reference option. We talked about the little Hawkware tool that allows you to skip a few steps in there and save you some time. We also talked about the update references options, whether that's a manual or automatic process, and then the reference dialog options, which options are you using to automatically select children components. And the last thing we want to touch on is the copy tree function. So if you don't have familiarity with this, it's basically like the pack and go function on steroids. So let's take a look at an example of how to use this. So if I have this assembly in this new folder and I want to create a new assembly, I'm going to create a new folder for it called new assembly. And I have a design that's very similar to this support frame. And I want to create a new design based on this, but share some of the same components and just change a few of the parts. So I want to make the most use of my shared components and still have unique designs. So what I can do in EPDM is leverage the copy tree functionality. So if I go to Tools and Copy Tree, I have this option to move the file to a new location, so my new destination. I'm going to say I want to move this to, or copy this to my new assembly folder. Select that folder there. And I have some settings that I can play with here, whether I'm going to use the latest or referenced version, if this is going to be a bunch of files, or a zip file. A compressed archive is what that means. I have some other options as well, whether I'm going to add a prefix or rename with serial number, so I can add a new dash to the names of my files and so on. And then down here in my display, what I can see is the option to choose whether to copy or maintain the current file. So if I'm copying the file, I'm creating a brand new copy of it. It's removed from the links to the other assemblies. And if I don't select it, then that part is going to be shared between the two locations. So for example, if I wanted to share this lower brace subassembly between my two assemblies, I could just deselect it. And so all of these parts will now be shared between this new assembly and the current assembly. So I'm going to create a new copy of this support frame, and it's going to reference the same lower brace as before. I can also change the target file name automatically, as well as the destination folder path if I wanted to change those individually. But I'll go ahead and use this copy to copy those files over, and it will go ahead and create the copies of those documents, and then I can go take a look at the reference structure and kind of show you what the referencing looks like in that new folder. So if I select my new assembly and take a look at the support frame under the Contains tab, what we're going to see is that it's referencing some of the parts from the old design in the parts 1 folder, and some of the new parts are in the new assembly folder. So it shares between the two locations, the parts that I chose to share, and it creates new copies of the files that I wanted to create new copies of. So that's a good way to share my data and keep those references intact. All right, so the next topic that I want to tackle here for the tips and tricks is the search capabilities of Enterprise PDM. So it's based on a SQL database, using that database to leverage the data card information and metadata of the SOLIDWORKS and other types of files that you're storing inside your vault. So how do you work with search favorites in EPDM and export your search results and make sure that you're searching properly? So I'm going to touch on each one of those in the search tool capabilities. So the first thing that we'll touch on is the search tool, which is this little magnifying glass up at the top right, not your Windows search, but the EPDM search. And the first thing that I'll do is go to this little drop down, and these are my different search cards, the different ways I can search for information inside the vault. And this drop down is linked to what we call the integrated search because it's integrated with Windows Explorer. So I'm going to click Complete Search, and it'll maintain my little Windows Explorer session. And from there I can create my searches, so I can look for all SOLIDWORKS documents inside my vault, or particularly inside this folder that I'm looking at right here, this new assembly folder. Now, if I'm always searching for the same kind of information, I might want to save a search favorite. So how do you save a search favorite and edit it in EPDM? That's my question. So let's say that I'm always looking for SOLIDWORKS documents that are in a workflow state called pending approval. And so I want to always run that search. What I can do is add that as a search favorite. And that's controlled through this little star icon here. And I can click Add to Favorites, and it will add the current criteria that I have selected for my search tool and add it as a favorite. So I can say parts pending approval. And what that will allow me to do is save that favorite. I can share that with other users or groups inside my vault, or keep it to myself. Just depends on my preference there. And then whenever I clear my search and run that favorite again, it's going to recall those search criteria instantly and run that search for me. So I click the favorite, it pulls up SOLIDWORKS parts that are in the workflow state pending approval, which is pretty great. Now, what happens if I'm running a search and I want to export those search results? How can I do that? Export those to Excel or something like that? How would I be able to do that? So what we can use is what's called the search tool. So that's this option down here at the bottom, and you might not notice it immediately, but it's actually a separate tool and it has a little bit more functionality, more features than the integrated search. So I'm going to click Search Tool. It's going to open this second window, and I'm going to run my complete search here. And you see it's basically the same interface, the same search card, and it's got the same favorites as we can see there. I can also edit my favorites in this search tool, so I can go to Properties, rename it, delete it, change my share options for that search favorite, that kind of thing. But another neat thing about this search favorite is that I can save my search results into an Excel format. So if I run my search here and I want to save these search results, I can just go to this Excel icon and open the search results, and it will open it up as a CSV file in Excel that I can use and manipulate and send out to other people that want to know the status of certain documents. So that's a really nice feature for exporting those search results into Excel. And then the last thing I want to cover here with the search tool is the clear search option. So a lot of times when you're running into an issue where you know that a file exists inside the vault and you're typing in all the information correctly and you just can't find your search results, a lot of the times the factor that's keeping you from finding that information is that you've got multiple search criteria strung out along different tabs. So for example, if I'm looking for all SOLIDWORKS files in my vault, it obviously pulls up some results. But let's say that I was working around in my different search tabs, and I forgot that I added 123 as my document number, and suddenly I run a search and there's no results. If I go back to my name and location tab, it looks like I'm just searching for SOLIDWORKS documents, and when I run the search I don't get any results. I know I have them in there. The reason why is because I haven't cleared out my other search criteria across all the different tabs. So the way that you can do that is simply through this clear search icon, the little refresh button, and that'll clear out all those criteria for me, and I can go ahead and type in my new search criteria again and run a search like that. Might have another one lingering from my search favorites. So, but that clear search allows me to clear those options immediately. All right, so what about licensing? How does licensing work with Enterprise PDM? How can I make sure that my users are logging off automatically so they're not hogging up licenses? Or how can I make sure that I'm logging in as the correct user in EPDM? So we'll talk about both of those issues here coming up. So the first thing that we'll address is logging off automatically. So in Enterprise PDM, there's an option under the license tab that allows you to automatically log off users after 30 minutes of inactivity. So when you go into the admin tool, there's an option under license. You'll see it look something like this, license. And what you're going to see there, if you click on license, is this option that says automatic log off. And when you select that, there's an option underneath of it that says log off users automatically. If you make sure that that checkbox is selected, then it will automatically log off users after the maximum number of users have been reached. 30 minutes of inactivity, it'll bump someone off that's not using it. So that's how you can make sure that users are automatically being logged off of Enterprise PDM. But what if you want to stop yourself from automatically logging in? For example, you want to log in as the administrator for your vault, but it keeps logging you in with your username from Windows. How do you make sure that it doesn't automatically log you in as your Windows user every single time? You want to log in as the admin or another user to test some settings. How can you make sure that that happens correctly? So we'll take a look at that. The way that you can control that on the local machine is under settings once again. So if I go to settings, there's an option in there called automatic login. And if I go to my vault, my training vault in this instance, I can see that there's a checkbox that says use server default. And by default, it's going to automatically log me in with my Active Directory account or my Windows login. And if I want to stop that from happening, I can just deselect use server default, and this will make sure that I manually log into my vault every single time. It doesn't automatically read in my Windows credentials in order to access the vault. That way I can log in as the admin. So I can click OK, and then when I go to log into my vault, for example, log off of my training vault here, it will prompt me with the dialog box to enter my username and password. And so I can enter that in at that point. So that's how you can stop it from automatically logging you in every time. All right, and so here we have our final category for today's webinar, which is miscellaneous. We're going to talk about some different ways that we can utilize EPDM a little more effectively or find some little tips and tricks that will help you in your day-to-day tasks. So the first thing we'll talk about is folder display. Sometimes your folder displays will be in a format that you don't like, and how are you going to be able to change that so that it's consistent across all of your different folders? How do we use the work offline feature to continue working with files even if we're not connected to the database? How do we disallow duplicate file names from being used inside our vault? And then how do we use the configuration tabs and make sure that we're looking at the correct metadata and information about our files in EPDM? And then finally, how do we customize the SOLIDWORKS add-in? So we'll talk about each one of those here for the miscellaneous and tips and tricks. First one that we're going to talk about is the folder display. So I don't know if you've ever encountered this in your vault. I know I have. You come into the vault and it by default has these medium icons, and those are nice if you want a bigger view of your folders, but a lot of times you're looking for information that's contained inside the columns. So if you go to details view, that's going to display the information that you're looking for. But sometimes if you change it to details view, it's still going to propagate with the medium icons. And so when you go back and you change your medium icons at the top level, it doesn't quite go all the way down to the second level. So I'm continuing with properties or projects, sorry. I go to details and I would expect it to populate down, and it does, but sometimes it doesn't. So how do we make sure that this applies to all of my folders? So if I go to medium icons here, sorry, let's go there at the top level. If I go to this medium icons, I want my details view to push down to all my folders and stay that way. How can I do that? So what I can do is go to details, make sure that I've got all my columns out, and then what I need to do is go to organize. And under organize, I can go to folder and search options, and then under view, there's an option called apply to folders. This applies that view that I have, that details view, and applies it to all of the subsequent folders underneath of it. So I'll click yes to apply that to folders and click OK. And that's what's going to push that details view all the way down through all my folders inside the vault. So that's a nice little tip. Maybe you get annoyed with switching those back and forth between medium and details. That's the way that I've found that works the best to make sure the details view continues down into all of your subsequent folders. The second thing that we're going to talk about with tips and tricks is working offline. How do I work on my files while I'm disconnected from the network? I don't want to have to be connected to the network all the time while I'm working on files. How can I leverage the work offline feature of EPDM? So work offline, what this allows me to do is I can go into my assemblies folder here, and I've got these files local on my machine, and if I go ahead and check it out, this assembly, make sure that I've got all the local files and check out what I need to work on, what I need to be making changes to, then I can choose to work offline and disconnect from the database and continue to work with those files in the offline mode while I'm disconnected to the database. Obviously, while I'm disconnected, other users can't check those files out. I still have them checked out to me, so no one's going to be overwriting my data while I'm away from the office. And then when I return to the office, I can just simply connect back in and propagate my changes back to the database. So if I go to Tools and Work Offline, it's going to remove my access to the database and keep those files that I have local, so that if I go to C and my training vault, I'm going to see that my folders are blue now instead of green. And that means that I'm disconnected from the database and I'm only working with files that I have local on my machine. I'm not looking at the database server to see what files I have in the vault in general, but I still have my files that I have checked out and they're writable. I can check them, I can make changes to them, and then once I'm done with those changes, I can reconnect back to the network when I get back to the office, go to work online, and then check in the changes that I've made while I was working offline. So I'm reconnected, I can check back in, and everything goes as planned. So that's how I can use work offline. Now what about duplicate file names? If I want to make sure that no one is adding a duplicate file name for shaft or screw or fasteners, whatever it is that are really common parts, bracket, I'd only want one copy of that file with that name to exist inside my vault. I want it to be a clean vault. How do I disallow duplicate file names? Well, that's a setting that you can control in the admin tool. So if I go into my administration tool, I can go up here to file types, and what it will allow me to do is select my SOLIDWORKS document, part, assembly, or drawing. If I right click and go to properties, there's an option in there called do not allow duplicate file names for this extension. And if I select that, it's going to disallow me from adding new files with that same duplicate file name into the vault. So that's the setting that I can use to disallow duplicate file names. Then the last two things that we'll talk about here are the configuration tabs and the SOLIDWORKS add-in. So configuration tabs are important. Configuration tabs are basically different ways that you can add configuration specific properties to your data card. So for example, in this case, I have a support frame that has a mahogany support frame and then a teak support frame. And those have different properties based on the different materials that are being used, and that makes sense. But a lot of times what happens is there's two tabs. There's an at tab and there's a default tab. So that's the default configuration, and then the at configuration is basically the custom properties that are not configuration specific. And what a lot of times can happen is a user can default onto the default configuration and they think that they're missing their metadata. They don't have their custom property information, but really they're just defaulting to this default configuration tab instead of defaulting to the at tab where it contains the custom property information for the file that's not configuration specific. And that's controlled through one of the display options. So if I go to display and options, there's an option in there called set focus to active configuration. And what that's going to do is set my focus to the last activated configuration in my document. And that means that I'm going to automatically go to a configuration tab and not the at tab. So if I want my users to always default to that at tab, I just need to go back to display and options and go to set focus to active configuration and make sure that that's unchecked. So that now when I navigate through my different data cards, it's always going to automatically go to the at tab right there on my data card. So that's a little feature that you might not run into that much, but can be helpful for users that are maybe a little unfamiliar with the way data cards work and SOLIDWORKS configurations are managed. And the last thing that we're going to talk about here with Enterprise PDM tips and tricks is how do we customize the SOLIDWORKS add-in so that we have customized colors on the task pane for EPDM. So what I'm going to do here is go into my Enterprise PDM options. And under view setting, there's a couple options for background color. So if I want to change my background color when I'm highlighting things that have changed inside my assembly, I can highlight those with different colors in my task pane. So for example, I can choose green or red to indicate a file is newer or older than what's inside the vault, so that when I check out a file, for example, opening up a file from my training vault, go ahead and go into my legacy design folder here, grab an assembly. So go ahead and open that up, check it out. I can make a change to my document, maybe grab a previous version, and this highlighted color is what I'm changing in my EPDM options. So if you did want to change that background color to make it a little more obvious as to what has changed and make it a little more obvious to users when things have changed, that's the way that you can do it, just going into Enterprise PDM, and under options there's that view setting that allows you to change the background color. All right, so what we covered today, we covered a lot of hopefully interesting information that you've either not seen before. It's going to help you with your day-to-day tasks in Enterprise PDM. We talked about references, whether that's copy tree, paste as reference, downloading a Hawkware app to smooth out that paste as reference process. We talked about the search tool, how to search for information and clear search results and save favorites. Talked about licensing and how you make sure that your users are automatically logging off the vault, and then some additional miscellaneous tips and tricks here, working offline, changing your SOLIDWORKS add-in to customize your view. So I want to thank you for attending today's webinar, and please keep an eye on our EPDM tutorials page as well as our YouTube channel, where we'll be rolling out some more videos related to our EPDM Academy content. So thanks for watching.